So you're both co-hosts. I'm going to mute myself in a minute, and then I'm just about to admit everybody in, yeah?
Yeah, Alex, just one thing before you do that. I will not be able to stay for the whole talk because I have another meeting. So if you please could handle the questions, that would be amazing. I will drop out at some point through the conversation, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine, of course. And then at the end, let's wrap it up and thank everybody. That's absolutely fine. Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, perfect. Let's do it.
Okay.
Great.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome for joining us. It's so sad that we can't have you in a lecture theater and have nice and informal conversations before the start of the lecture as we normally do. But please know that we are very, very delighted to have you with us this evening. And Alex is doing the admin for us, so she will give us the green light when we have all our participants in our virtual lecture hall, and then I will start the proceedings and introduce our guest for tonight.
I think we're ready to go whenever you are, Ulrika.
Excellent. Well, then a very warm, formal welcome to this, the second of our lectures in the 2020-2021 joint lecture series that we are presenting as the Aga Khan Museum in collaboration with, of course, our main partners in this initiative, AKU-ISMC and the Aga Khan Trust for Cultures Education Program. This year, the museum and also the Aga Khan Academy, the Agency for Habitat, are added partners in bringing this lecture series to you, which of course this year very pertinently concentrates on all aspects of sustainability. I am Ulrika Al-Khamis, the interim director of the Aga Khan Museum, and it is my deepest heartfelt pleasure this evening to welcome one of my greatest colleagues and friends in the field of Islamic art and culture at large. It's hard very much to really describe Azra comprehensively, because in addition to being a consummate intellectual, scholar, academic, a phenomenal, deep artist, I would say her greatest value to this world is as a committed humanitarian and social activist for making the world a better place in everything that she does, as a teacher, as a speaker, and as an artistic practitioner. And you will have seen in the invitation all the amazing things that she's been doing over her distinguished career. I met her first in earnest, I would say, in my former life as a co-director of the Museum of Islamic Civilization in Sharjah in the UAE, where we started working on a project together, but then also over a wonderful project that she came in on, developed for the Aga Khan Museum. This project, Sanctuary, is an exploration of humanity's need and seeking sanctuary in an age of unprecedented displacement. We have about 70 million people on the move as we speak. And Azra was the one I turned to due to her phenomenal work with refugees in some of the largest refugee camps in the world, particularly in Jordan at the moment, to become our exhibition designer and create structures around the objects in the galleries that reflect her concern for refugees, her concern for the environment, and her belief that the arts can be a most powerful vehicle in addressing big topics of our time and invite critical thinking around them. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Azra Aksamija. Over to you, Azra.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for your very generous introduction, and thank you for all the Aga Khan network agencies, our hosts, for bringing us today. I'm also very sorry we cannot be together physically, but from my experience now, this online format also allows for people to connect across borders and maybe also save some of the traveling cost and environmental hazardous impact on our planet. So there is a benefit to that as well. So tonight I will focus on the exhibition Sanctuary that I had the pleasure of collaborating on with the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, and I designed the exhibition architecture for. But before I get in there, I will also show you kind of broader scope of my work and how it relates to some of the thoughts about Earth as a sanctuary, specifically in this exhibition. The exhibition Sanctuary had just closed at the Aga Khan Museum, was originally organized by the Foresight Foundation, a San Francisco-based nonprofit, which commissioned 36 artists from 22 countries to create woven artworks highlighting the need for refuge, protection, and sacred ground. And you see here an installation of that at the Fort Mason Center for the Arts and Culture in 2017. Each wool rug is 4 by 6 foot large, and they were woven in Lahore in Pakistan. Artisans of the Al Rug workshop wove these rugs following centuries-old regional techniques and using more than 100 different colors. These carpets as a collective reflect the artists' very diverse backgrounds and belief systems. They reflect their personal responses to the notion of the sanctuary, whether that means refuge, sacred space, a place of beauty, or something entirely unique. And Ulrike had a wonderful idea to bring this exhibition to the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, but then work with a group of both local and international artists to kind of create a new interpretation of the exhibition. And you see here one photograph of the exhibition installation, how different it was arranged rather than this kind of horizontal display of carpets. There was quite an interplay of them throughout the space. I should mention that the exhibition then in the Aga Khan Museum was co-curated by Cheryl Hines for the Foresight Foundation and Michael Chagnon for the Aga Khan Museum. I had the honor and extreme pleasure to work with such an incredible institution like the Aga Khan Museum. They have the best team, not only for the professional kind of work they do, but also for the creativity and out-of-the-box thinking of the entire team. On my end, I collaborated with Natalie Belfleur and Lilian Kologi from my Future Heritage Lab, and I thank them very much for the excellent collaboration. So before I dive into the different dimensions of the exhibition, I wanted to first give you a little bit insight on where I come from, kind of in terms of ideas and personal background, and how I personally relate to this very important subject of what is the sanctuary, what is the safe haven today. The first dimension is, I see here a typo, I'm sorry, is the destruction of the sanctuary. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which in the 1990s, as you know, experienced civil war and a genocide that particularly affected the Bosnian Muslim population, where over 70% of Islamic cultural heritage was systematically targeted and destroyed or completely erased, let's say. And you see here one of the images of like mosque being destroyed and people, returnees after the war, coming to pray on the site of the ruin. The religious places and sanctuaries were specifically targeted because they are the most poignant vehicles of relating people's identity to territory. They are a place of a community, they are a place of tradition and spirituality, place of strength, and as such, they are also very important for the recovery of the community after the war. So, but where does one move on in context like that in Bosnia, where there are no winners? It's not clear who actually won or lost that war, if anyone. The genocide is only recognized in the case of Srebrenica massacre, but there are so many other massacres that haven't been recognized as such. So in order to start the process of healing, I worked to map and document the systematic and targeted nature of destruction using the vehicle of art as a part of my academic scholarship. Sometimes people are not open to speak to an artist rather to a historian, and to open up and start speaking of what happened to them. And I created this artwork called Monument in Waiting, a hand-woven carpet, which is inspired by Afghan war rugs, and that uses the traditional form of carpet weaving to, on the one hand, document and interweave historical facts with personal memories, and on the other hand, provide a form and a medium for healing. It was woven by women who survived torture camps, and where the weaving itself is basically a form of a kind of trauma therapy. So there's the carpet with its visual encoding and connected to an archive that is related to academic scholarship, but then there is this other dimension that is haptic and provides healing. The other dimension of sanctuary that I'm interested in is the sanctuary of belonging. As from my own background as a Bosnian and someone who exiled then during the war to Western Europe, and myself have experienced prejudices and stereotypes against Muslim population in Western Europe. I'm now Austrian citizen, but I lived in Holland, in Germany. And in all these places, I have encountered not only kind of very charged debates and attacks actually on Muslim communities, specifically Muslim women are always a target, and they get beaten up often on the street because they're recognizable for their veiling practices. So I was interested to see what is behind these very emotionally charged debates of how mosques should or could look like, and who is allowed to be visible in public space in Western cities, and who decides that. So there is a body of my work that engages the representation of Islamic identity or identities in the mosque that tries to tackle the paradoxes of simultaneous belonging to different places. So here you see a project called Dirndl Moschee or Dirndl Dress Mosque. It's an Austrian traditional dress, the costume that is kind of recreated from local materials to unfold. The apron unfolds into a prayer rug for 3 people, and the traditional scarf that you wear on the shoulders can facilitate worship of 3 people. And this piece is inspired by the famous Renaissance altar in the Church of St. Wolfgang, where I did this piece. So this kind of project represents, it's inspired by the Prophet Muhammad's notion of the entire world potentially that where you pray, that is your mosque. So the human body could be seen as the minimal sacred space. But beyond that spiritual dimension, there is the dimension of sharing and a kind of seeing yourself in the other, in the aesthetic of the mosque, like in this Dirndl Moschee that signals that, you know, a Muslim woman can be Austrian and appreciating that tradition, but also belonging and affiliated to Islamic belief. I play with this transcultural aesthetic in other projects. This is on the right, you see my design for the first Islamic cemetery in Vorarlberg. That's Austrian westernmost province of Austria, where you have a very diverse Muslim community that up to that point was not able to bury their dead in Austria. The cemetery was designed by the architect Bernardo Bader, and he invited me to create an artistic installation in form of the carpets and the mihrab Qibla wall in the mosque interior. And what I did here was kind of finding a hybrid language that utilizes local craft and materials, like the wooden shingles that this region is famous for, but then to reinscribe them and rearrange them to kind of also find a unifying language that could accommodate spiritual and cultural needs of the community that is very diverse. They have, you know, from Alevis to Sunnis to, I mean, people coming from Turkey, Bosnia, Chechnya. What is a place that would represent them? And most importantly, how do we signal that Austria has become a new place? It was a very significant project. For that reason, it received the Aga Khan Award in 2013. The entire cemetery project, of course, and the community, because it signaled that notion of belonging and kind of mediated collaboration between Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim communities on the ground to find that shared ground and to also facilitate legal enable these communities to get buried in the place they now call home. Finally, the third dimension that I'm more recently working on is the notion of future heritage. And in 2016, I founded the Future Heritage Lab at MIT, which is an interdisciplinary research enterprise with individuals working across fields of art, urbanism, architecture design, and historic preservation. And we try to relate concerns of heritage preservation with concerns of humanitarian aid to bring these two together, to see, okay, what is the future of thousands of those people who are living in these refugee camps, in this sea of steel, people who have lost and whose history, memory, and identity has been shattered and erased. How do they move on, and how will they build a new future upon return? So for 5 years now, I have been working with my colleagues in the Al-Azraq refugee camp in Jordan. This is a camp that houses over 1,000 Syrian refugees. And it's in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of 1.5 hour drive to the east from Amman. In the middle of the desert, there's not a single tree, and you see here on the right bottom kind of this endless array of steel shelters. And here, refugees themselves are kind of countering the austerity of the humanitarian architecture with a proposition of what could be called a cultural shelter, a kind of replica out of mud of Palmyra Arch. In front of someone's steel shelter, they created a new shelter to signal where they come from, to communicate kind of and claim their identity and dignity. So in this camp, we collaborate with a group of young people, but also in the meantime, it has become a larger network. Initially, it started with the Azra Camp Journal team, a youth group that documents the life in the camp and incites literature. We built relationships with local universities and groups in design and art sector. Here you see some images from our workshop in the camp where artists and designers met and exchanged ideas. And important is that there is always a kind of multi-directional knowledge exchange happening also across generations, as you see in the right image. And the outputs of this work are very different. Again, it is trying to find the space of where is the notion of safe haven in those spaces that really about you see here an image of the project called Lightweaver that we did in 2017, a little educational device, a little mechanical lamp made out of trash, of recycled trash that you can find in the camp, that translates traditional embroidery and into a kind of three-dimensional weaving of light, and as such it can enable to transform the very austere steel shelters into a kind of interplay of light and create a cultural shelter inside. We also try to learn as designers from the kind of interventions that refugees themselves are doing to humanize humanitarian aid. For example, you see here, this is the ready-made standardized so-called tea shelter, and the way many people are kind of plastering and using different textiles and found objects, trash also to beautify and personalize the environment. And then we infuse those with components of history to create new designs and creative work in the camp. This is the project called Tea Serai. The tea shelter gets transformed into a tea serai, another kind of ready-made, made out of trash, recycled clothes. A lot of these clothing donations that end up in these refugees camps are not culturally appropriate and are actually not useful, but they could be used to create these insulating and so you see here a system of tapestries made out of multiple layers of fabric using humanitarian textiles and discarded clothes, and jeans, for example, on the outside with refugee blankets to deflect heat, and then inside this beautiful kind of archway. But also there are lessons and kind of transcultural exchanges happening over these designs of textiles where students in different places co-designing and co-creating these to shape the. So now to the exhibition itself, just to show you a little bit the structure. How the visitor enters the exhibition here You see my cursor, right? I hope so. From the visitor would enter the exhibition from this side, and we have the main exhibition area, a long hallway that overlooks a gallery to the ground floor, and we end up here with the last space that is a majlis. So I will now guide you through the different dimensions of this exhibition. So we enter through the void that is kind of bringing the visitor into a very dark space. Ulrike mentioned the numbers of the highest record number of refugees and forcibly displaced people. Over 70 million people have been displaced, and this number is even growing now with increasing threats. So the visitor is kind of faced with these facts and then enters the space of the carpets. Now, the carpets in the exhibition have been organized into three sections. The first section is a section that is titled Sanctuary in the Age of Displacement. I will just show a selection of artworks just to give you an idea, if you haven't seen this exhibition, what kinds of works were exhibited.
Azra, may I just interrupt for a moment? I think
Yes.
there is some interference. Could that be from your microphone? There's a sound as if something is scraping along, so just that you are aware.
Okay, good to know. I will
Sorry
try.
to interrupt.
No problem. So Haiva Karmaran's carpet is titled Kachachi, meaning the smuggler in Iraqi dialect, which captures the artist's childhood memory of her family hiring a smuggler to flee to Sweden. And another piece of Rano Mukhare's work is called Begin, and it weaves together the plight of contemporary refugees in search of a better life. This piece overlays the traces of images of refugees who are trying to cross into Canada from the United States in fear of the new, very harsh anti-immigration policies. The overlay of these traces creates jacquard loom-like weaving structure reminiscent of the fabrics worn by these refugees. The next section is the Sanctuary of the Mind, where you could see, for example, the work of Mohamed Bozorokis, whose works in the rich Arabic and Persian tradition of calligraphy. His piece is called I Am Nobody, Who Are You? And it challenges the notion that war can strip us away, our identity, and destroy ties between families and friends. The work is a three-dimensional weaving of calligraphy, repeating the word Hawa, a mystical term used in Persian in reference to God. For the artist, homeland is in the hands of those who love us, and to lose peace means that one has forgotten that we all belong to one another. Brandon Fernandez worked with a collaborator to create this lattice work design for the carpet titled In Trust. It is inspired by West African batik, with roses defining fallen human body. The lattice pattern is formed by PrEP pills, medication used to help prevent the spread of HIV, a safe haven for many people taking them. And as we are now particularly relevant to all of us, also affected by COVID pandemic. The ritual of taking these pills on a daily basis is linked to a prayer ritual. It links the suffering of those affected by HIV to also other marginalized groups. And then the last section is called Universal Sanctuary, where we can see, for example, the work of Jonah Comfra, piece that points to the earliest human need to find shelter and mark our presence in time and space. This project represents a kaleidoscopic reinterpretation of the stenciled handprints found in the Cave of the Hands in Argentina that were created over 9,000 years ago. Alfredo Jar's piece Requiem recreates candlelight to bring hope and light to an era of growing fear, mistrust, and oppression that is threatening the freedom of many of us across the world. Now, to the looms themselves, through a specific selection of materials, the looms guides the visitors through the exhibition, forming a critical reflection on the consumerism that is governing the economy in which we exist. The stainless steel post and rivet system, which act as a loom's conjure images of retail warehouses and their association to mass waste. Threaded between these combs are shredded t-shirts, wrapped and weft, represent the fast fashion overstock sitting in warehouses, awaiting inevitable destruction at the end of the fashion season. By rethreading the loom with the designated discard, the exhibition architecture probes how these items can bring value to those in need. So the display system was designed to, it was a bit tricky how to make this, we were not able to actually hang it from the ceiling as initially planned, but the idea was that these looms would on the one hand weave both in color and in structure the carpets together formally and structurally, at times also creating background or a space around them, and at the same time to facilitate participation of exhibition visitors. So as I mentioned, the looms are actually made out of this ready-made steel poles and then shredded t-shirts. Over 3,000 t-shirts were used for the creation of this exhibition. The t-shirts were collected, around 1,000 of them, I think, came through the open call from the constituency and from audiences, visitors of the museum. And then the rest was sourced by local secondhand shop. Those t-shirts were then organized, they were washed, so not to create a hazardous threat to the visitors, organized according to color, and then shredded into strips, and then knotted to kind of color code the different sections of the exhibition. With the t-shirts, the choice of the material was specific to kind of to address each one of us. Everyone that I know has a t-shirt at home. We all participate in the global system that produces, on the one hand, kind of connections across the world, but on the other hand, also pollution and destruction of our future heritage. And through the use of this material, the exhibition hopes to bring that into attention. At the end of the exhibition, in that long hallway that oversees the ground floor gallery, we have an 18-meter long drawing called the process drawing that I initiated and led and collaborated with Natalie Belfort, Stratton Kaufman, Isadora Danin, and Emily Wiesemann, my students and alumni from MIT, to research a kind of story of the world through the lens of a t-shirt and unpack what has been used in the exhibition itself. So you see where exactly this drawing is positioned, and it's pretty large. Its design is inspired by sewing patterns that of the kind of burda and do-it-yourself type of sewing instructions. So we are now in this point of the exhibition. And you see from the overview that there are kind of these lines in the background, and then the red figures, they are meant to look like almost kind of icons that connect different scenes. But the scenes are actually 3 stories that are intertwined. the stories are read from right to left as the visitor kind of closes and finishes the exhibition. There is the environmental story, the technological story, and the social dimension, and they are intertwined, kind of chronological, but also more thematic. And I will show you a couple of vignettes from that. So over the blue plot line examines the technologies of the t-shirt production from the cultivation of the cotton plant and their industrial fabrication and sale over the 5,000-year history of the human cultivation of cotton. Farmers and producers have bred new strains, including the most prevalent today, Gossypium hirsutum. Compared with their ancient predecessors, this strain yield more long, white-limbed and are capable of growing in the wide range of environmental zones, expanding cotton's reach. And then BT cotton, a cotton plant variety genetically modified to produce an insecticide to kill bollworm, is the first approved for these trials in the United States. By 2014, more than 93% of cotton grown in the United States and India was genetically modified. The red narrative traces the social impact of t-shirts, juxtaposing the global mobility of consumer goods with the exploitation of human labor. Advanced, so we are now with Eurasian steppe and Silk Road in the Middle Ages. Advanced textile craft tradition emerged in the Byzantine Empire and elsewhere. Tapestries and other richly patterned textiles become treasured goods in the trade network of Eurasian steppe, transmitting scenes of folklore and religious tales between geographically distinct cultures. United States, 19th century, Harriet Power and Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley enslaved women in the antebellum American South, sustained and enriched the decorative art of quilt making, using the medium to preserve and transmit shared histories. Many enslaved women make quilts for both the plantation family and their own kin, occasionally using their artisan skills to find partial relief from other more punishing forms of forced labor. Xinjiang province, 2014 to 2018. The Chinese government sets up some 2,200 new cotton and apparel companies and provides forced labor from re-education camps to work in the Xinjiang production facilities. In 2018, China documents the employment of 450,000 new Uyghur workers from impoverished households, relatives of convicted and detained, and the re-education camp inmates. The green story traces the environmental footprint of t-shirts through the resources and the pollution of its manufacturing process. So in Uzbekistan, 2010, the government of Uzbekistan sets cotton production targets that mandate cotton cultivation on more than 50% total cropland. This puts a strain on nearby water resources, such as the Aral Sea, as water is diverted for irrigation. Formerly the fourth largest sea in the world, the Aral Sea had declined by 10% of its original size by 1997. In 2014, satellite imagery showed that one of the four basins had entirely dried up. Then finally, to the post-use life in 2017, a piece of clothing is recycled in three ways. It is resold at a lower price, it is exported to a developing country as a part of the bulk sale, or it is chemically and mechanically treated to be reused as raw material for the manufacturing of other products. But many garments are not recycled. Only 13% of the total material input, cotton and plastic fiber, is in some way recycled after clothing use. In fact, every second, the equivalent of one garbage truck full of textile is incinerated or landfilled. These interconnected stories weave together the historic and contemporary issues, and they raise questions about the environmental, ethical, and human impact of cotton t-shirt production. How can we reimagine the world we live in today and foster global sanctuary for future generations? We also picked up this theme of environmental sustainability in the most nuances of the exhibition. Traditional exhibitions used vinyl lettering. Here, the Aga Khan Museum insisted to use to hire a calligrapher artist to do all the inscription for the exhibition and not to use plastic. Also, for everything that had to be printed, like the photographs, for example, we used falcon board, which is recyclable material. So after this piece, we come to the last section of the exhibition, which is a majlis, in Arabic word for a place of gathering, a place that is also about negotiation, governance maybe, of future issues, but also a place of welcoming guests into kind of public area of your home. And in this majlis, we invite visitors to sit and contemplate on what is seen on the walls and what is kind of produced with this exhibition for the future. Here, the exhibition supported our work on the publication of the research about the Azra refugee camp in Jordan. I showed the slide earlier, a camp that was designed to become the largest camp in the Middle East. It has the capacity to facilitate 150,000 refugees. It's not at full capacity, but it could become. And this is the cutting edge of the humanitarian architecture today. The challenges are huge. 1,000 people are arriving per day, so standardized solutions are the ones that are provided, but those fully neglect human needs and cultural and emotional needs. And in this space of desperation, we find a space of life, which is just incredibly inspiring people like Abu Zuhair, 70-year-old man who is creating these amazing toys out of trash. This is insulation given for the wintering of the shelters to put a smile on the face of these kids. Other people who are creating windmills at the time when there was no electricity in the camp, or recreating the solar lights given to them by the United Nations to create cell phone chargers, air conditioners to beat the unbearable heat of these shelters in the summer, but also other kinds of designs that are not about utilitarian needs, like the kind of majlis inside of such tea shelter that recycles UNHCR wool blankets, and to create a space, and you see again the prayer carpets also cladding the space, a space worth living. Here, a man created a shisha fountain, a kind of hybrid of a water pipe with plastic buckets to create a fountain, which is a fully functional fountain that is providing a space of like a sanctuary, let's say, for him through the sound of water, reminding him of where he came from. With our students at MIT and in Jordan, we worked with the Syrian designers to analyze and kind of reverse engineer those designs and to designate them as claims to design. This is not a kind of a piece of scrap made by someone. It is a highly sophisticated design piece that is so well engineered in absence on any kind of tool that you would have. And it was quite interesting to learn from these. So we're working on a publication and online course that integrates these, and where students can learn from these inventions of refugees. And you see here these wonderful kind of drawings that the students assembled by bringing together these different designs for visitors to learn from. I would like to conclude with a poem that we created together with MIT students, Syrian refugees from Azra camp, and our Jordanian and Palestinian colleagues in Jordan, that describes this camp in a quite human ways. And it goes like this: placed in a homeless base, trapped, yet alive, a living part of the world. Here, dignity is invented, inspired by our heritage. We beat scarcity to exceed your comforts, living memories of home, still human. These are chess figurines created out of a broomstick. I would like to conclude with this poignant image again of the Palmyra Arch in front of the ready-made shelter to call attention to the cultural and emotional needs as essential human needs that are often not met in the kind of challenges that we are facing as a future humanity threatened by climate change, that those dimensions are really important to make people feel like people, and we can learn from refugees to how to create a life worth living. Thank you very much.
Azra, thank you. That was a visual feast, and it was wonderful to get an insight into your process as well. I really appreciate that. We have some questions coming through on the chat. If I could read the first one to you, and then perhaps you'd like to just pick up the ones that you would like to look at. Mariam is asking, will some of these designs be patented? I hope that the individuals and the inventors will be given credit, and perhaps by some of the course tutors even.
So in the book that we are currently working on, it's called Design to Live, 1002 inventions for a refugee camp. All designers who would like to be mentioned by name, some don't for the security reason, are of course credited. The designs will not be patented. We are kind of in agreement with everyone, reverse engineering them and putting them out there for dissemination in the camp so other people can learn from each other. I mean, I don't know who would, I cannot patent, these are not my designs. I just found them extremely fascinating and something to really learn from, and that needs to be positioned and kind of presented to policymakers and artists, architects, designers, those who are in charge of creating these refugee camps, to learn from them and to kind of include these people in creating livable spaces. I hope this answers the question. Let me see the chat. For some reason I don't see the chat. Alex, may I ask you to read it to me? For some reason I cannot see the chat.
Sure. So I'm waiting for the questions to come through at the moment, but I wondered if you, because your work is so contemporary and responds so much to what is going on at the moment, and I'm wondering if you are reflecting right now about the situation that we're in, and if you can give us an insight into perhaps what you're working on at the moment.
Yes, as you can imagine, the pandemic heavily affected refugee camps as well. So as we were working on this book and a number of other projects, the already kind of prison-like situation of these camps has been even more gated and imprisoned. Nothing goes in or out. I mean, not even humanitarian agencies and workers can go into these camps. They operate on a minimal capacity in this particular camp. Actually, these youth groups with whom we collaborated with took charge, and because they are quite skilled and knowledgeable, and they also speak many languages because they're in constant contact with all these internationals and humanitarians, they are running the show, and they are kind of taking on the work of humanitarian agencies that those in the pandemic are not able to do. We were fortunate to kind of continue different projects during the pandemic. I started a project called Co-Mask, kind of collaborative work to create face masks. This was at the time when the masks are not considered to be protective. Just to create a DIY instructions for people to make these out of trash, and again using types of layering that they could actually be protective and something they could access in the camps. And amazingly, a humanitarian agency CARE, with whom we collaborate, took this on and got this through the kind of approval process, and they want to now scale it up and produce 40,000 of these masks, like by refugees for the refugees. I created the instructions, but then there were around 70 people collaborating with me, just like joining from all over the world, also MIT students, everyone translating into their languages. So we have now, I think, 25 languages. It's quite amazing how once you have something and what art could do. These were just basic DIY masks, but with lips on them, that are also bringing humor and a kind of kiss and smile at this difficult time to inspire people to connect and to kind of share, caring and sharing. So with this exhibition, the reason why we also use t-shirts, the idea was to also, I don't know what will happen now with the pandemic, but the plan was that the entire exhibition comes down and we use these shredded t-shirts to weave carpets and create these little software packages. It's a term to signal, it's like a welcoming blanket on which you can have a picnic or invite guests. So the idea was to create and weave those into welcoming packages to new refugees to Canada. I hope we can still do this. A lot of the dimensions of the exhibition had to change due to security measures, but knowing the consciousness of the Aga Khan Museum group, I think this will still happen.
And Mohammed Mekdad is asking, from your experience, how and where the line should be drawn between representing the life of refugees and museumizing their experiences? Yeah,
that's a very good question. So during all these years, we continuously faced kind of difficult questions of ethics, of what are we doing there, and how are we presenting this work, where to draw that line, right? So parallel to this kind of research about the inventions went Code of Ethics project, ? Which brought together everyone working on the project to kind of discuss ethics of this across disciplinary cultural borders. After many years of kind of being completely frozen, and it's not an equal relationship. I mean, we can just, the fact that we can exit this camp and they cannot, it's it is what it is, right? But for me, it's just the fact that like I can come in or out doesn't mean that I just don't want to sit in my university and not do anything. So what are the kinds of skills and tools that we have and we can contribute? And those are really skills of an artist and designer. So in this group, we are not really representing or speaking on behalf of people. So in the book, for example, it is the voices of the people themselves and their own designs and their own perspectives. The drawings are the drawings of students like learning from these inventions. And the stories are the stories of people. So it's like always in conversation and of course with a kind of full disclosure and acceptance of them. And so we see our role more as editors who are, they are the authors, we are the editor, and people are kind of self-representing themselves. But it is fascinating that the book format and this kind of research and collaborations were facilitating for everyone to contribute with their own competencies. Some people have design skills. One guy knows calligraphy, the other one is an engineer. This woman knows how to weave. So it was a kind of everyone was contributing from the perspective of their own skill, and everyone was learning something new and contributing with something that they know better. And I think this is this honest and transparent type of work is something that we could do. Where the contribution of this can be is, I think, really in the speaking to the design field. First of all, these camps are designed for people to live like they live. They are designed to function like prisons, and I think the design also can have a capacity to kind of challenge those power relationships.
So Raheel is asking if you could talk some more about why carpets were selected as a form of preferred art rather than any other medium of expression.
The exhibition, well, as I don't know if you saw at the beginning, this was an existing exhibition that was commissioned by Forsyth Foundation. And carpet is a form that is traditionally kind of form of documenting, writing history, documenting people's lives through patterns. It is a form of knowledge transmission. And as I also showed at the beginning, a form of a kind of meditation and maybe even trauma recovery. So for that reason, I think I don't want to speak on behalf of those curators, but the medium itself has this very kind of charged and history that was able to bring together all these different perspectives on the notion of the sanctuary. So as you saw, the artists worked with very different visual clues. Some kind of used traditional carpet iconography and translated them. The others worked with the carpet more like a painting. And that was a kind of challenge, I think, for the traditional carpet weavers to translate those. If people want, also you can feel free to turn on your video, and I know we can speak in person. Hopefully, it's kind of weird to see all these names.
You just unmute yourself. Let me do that for you. You should be unmuted, Daniela.
No, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you for being here.
I wasn't really going to ask a question. I was just unmuted from the host.
Feel free to ask one if you have. It was interesting to the carpet question when I worked with the Bosnian women in the case of the first carpet that I showed. It was a medium that speaks to, you know, people also who are analphabet. Many of the people working with, I mean, who are affected by these destructions in Bosnia, for example, you know, they don't have access to these archives and to the International Criminal Tribunal and to all these documents, but they can read the carpet. And initially I came with the idea of creating something like that was quite painterly, but the weavers, the women said, no, this is not in the logic of the carpet. I can, you know, and they showed me how they work, and based on that, I designed the patterns. It was really like a back and forth dialogue. What you see here. So it's completely rooted in the Bosnian traditional carpet iconography with these three borders, but then instead of you know, traditional diamond pattern, there are grenades here, barbed wire and mines. So it's like the war story that surrounds the tree of life here. We left the carpet intentionally open and unfinished to indicate that the story of documenting and kind of to start speaking about what happened is an endless endeavor, and that many more stories need to be woven on top of it.
And I think from that, there's a couple of other questions about how these traditional skills and knowledge are preserved, and are any of these skills passed down to the children, to the teenagers, and to the youth as well?
Thank you for this question. Just in terms of informally, I would say. So there are official structures in the camps that, you know, that are kind of governed by the Jordanian government and are facilitated by UNHCR and a variety of NGOs working on the ground. And that is the formal education. It is quite limited. I mean, it's something like 2 or 3 hours per day for boys, and then girls separated. So it's not really sufficient. And it is a kind of, you know, already like less than the Jordanian kids would get taught. So Jordanian, Syrian teachers in the camp, and not just teacher, I mean, anyone who has some kind of knowledge, we are collaborating. One of the teachers is actually a former tourist guide from Damascus, who has developed such a care and love for these kids and is organizing everyone. I mean, it's just really admirable to see how in the middle of their own suffering, these people are like taking care of the kids and their future selflessly. And a lot of these teachers, you know, organize the kids and give them informal education after the formal one, after hours. So there's that happening. Preservation of knowledge, not really. I mean, there's the passing down between the generations. So we hope that, for example, this book would be also one of the kind of document of that moment in time that speaks to different audiences. For the people in the camp, it can be something that, you know, on the one hand acknowledges the inventiveness and dignifies these designs. On the other hand, can disseminate that knowledge across the camp. The book will be bilingual. on the other hand, for designers, architects, those designing these camps, it can be a useful tool to learn how to do these things better. And towards humanitarian system, it is a point of critique. It is not embracing the refugee camps as a solution. On the contrary, it is critiquing them. I'm not sure which other options we have, but while we have them, we could do a better job. And this dimension of how do we, like, what are the parameters that underlie the design of that humanitarian response are often kind of based on parameters of security or efficiency. And those parameters neglect the cultural and emotional dimension as an essential human need. And this is what you can learn from these inventions, that this is exactly what is also needed and what is so important.
And also a really interesting question, is there anything we can learn from the refugees that can be incorporated into the architecture or other aspects of our lives, which is outside of that space?
Well, certainly, I mean, on the human scale, it is incredible to me to see how people at the moment of an existential minimum. So, I mean, this kind of situations bring the worst and the best out of people. But when you look at the Syrian community, how they're supporting each other, and this notion of safe haven is really the kind of strength of the community and them being for each other there. So this empathy and sympathy and caring is something that many of us have lost in our lives, and I think that's kind of one of the most important dimensions. We live in a consumering society, and when you look at these places of absolute scarcity, this could be the future of all of us. The Azra camp is one of the places which, could happen to many places in the world. There is water scarcity, there is economic scarcity, there is forced displacement, traumatized, displaced population, violence. And there we can all learn from a kind of power of the human of humans to connect and to overcome this harshness through cultural resilience, I would say, through kind of holding on their traditions on the one hand, and kind of, but elastically and interpreting them and kind of enriching them with dimensions of new context. And this is something that I think we can also learn from a longer history of Islamic civilizations, where Islam was spreading. Just when you look at the Islamic architecture, it has developed in this dialogical kind of encounter with what was there before.
And I think we have just one final question, which is about what the symbols and the designs on the carpets represent. And I think we have spoken about this a little bit, but if there's anything else you feel that you would like to add on that.
You mean for the carpet in the exhibition, or in this particular one that is, I'm not sure where the question is referring to.
So the question says carpets, so I'm guessing that it's for all the carpets rather than the one that's chosen. But Mariam, feel free to either or.
Either or, yes. Well, I think I've spoken about some that are featured in the exhibition. Each artist picks up on them in a different way. Some, like I think it was the project with, let me see, John Aconfra's piece that works with the hands, for example, and he's like taking the hands from the cave of the hands in Argentina, and kind of that created over 9,000 years ago. which really represent a kind of human need to mark their presence in space and time, but then creates this kaleidoscopic to also link that gesture to the tradition of carpet weaving, for example. And as I said here in my own work, the tree of life pattern, for example, the central motif that you see here is one that signals the kind of, it's a tree that documents stories of destruction and reconstruction, and how a society can move from the ashes of war, but what are also the difficulties and challenges and dilemmas coming with that recovery process of the community. In case of Bosnia, you see all these birds at the carpet. Those stories are many. For example, in cases of many places, like where mosques were completely destroyed, even foundation stones were dug out, and graveyards were moved to completely erase the fact that the Muslim community lived in that specific place. People are responding with different ways. So in some cases, they'll build 4 minarets to really kind of monumentalize their presence and say, okay, we are back. And it's almost like an act of defiance. In other places, they have split, like this icon here, birds, 2 birds in the same nest. You see kind of 2 birds at the end of the tree branch. Here is a village that has split over the dilemma of how to deal with the trauma of war. In Ahmići, where 116 Bosnian Muslims were killed in one day by their, in that case, Croat neighbors. The trauma was so heavy that when they returned, half of them wanted to say, okay, we will build a monument to kind of commemorate what happened here. And the others said, no, we don't want to be reminded. We need to forget what happened and move on. And they just couldn't decide, and they even split over this dilemma. And for a while, the village was divided. Now they have 2 mosques in the same very small village. In other places, like here we have a bird with a little pig nose under the feet of the bird. It's a symbol that I designed to describe what happens to returnees when they're coming to those parts of Bosnia that are suffering almost like apartheid situation, where they have a right to return, but they are governed by those who are killing them and expelling them from that city. And so in Zvornik in eastern Bosnia, when they started restoring the Beksuja mosque, they found a slaughtered pig thrown into foundation stones, which was thrown in there to signal that they are not welcome back. And pig being a kind of considered an impure animal in Islamic culture was, so to say, a cultural weapon to tell them go away. They didn't react to this, and they didn't react also with defiance. They reconstructed their little mosque with respectful, in respect to history and also to their non-Muslim neighbors, as a form of reclaiming that history, to say we are back and we will kind of reconstruct our society, regardless if you want it or not. You work with Rohingya. We are now reaching out to Rohingya community. One project is in conversation. I hope it will work out. It's I haven't been in that part of the world, but my hope is to use my university and the kind of access and privileges we have to share some of that access. So we'll see if that project will work out, but the plan is to work in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh with our colleagues at BRAC, and to see how can we be helpful. it's also pretty difficult right now because of the, COVID. We cannot travel, nothing can access the camp. It's similar like in Jordan, so it's areas where there's anti-Muslim sentiment. So there's a question in areas where there is anti-Muslim sentiment, like in those posters, has mosque minaret architecture and design changed in response to it? Fascinating discussion. Yes, certainly. So there is, it's a very complex discussion. On the one hand, we have migrant communities insisting on their right to be visible and to have places of worship and to kind of signal where they come from. And oftentimes they, claim nostalgically to those forms from countries where they come from. So they'll often kind of, they get a calendar from, I don't know, some bank and see a beautiful monumental mosque and they want to build it exactly like that. So oftentimes you'll have forms transplanted from the Ottoman Empire in the middle of Germany. Right? On the other hand, part of the discussion is the anti-Muslim sentiment, and which often kind of uses architectural debate to actually mask pure racism and xenophobia. But architectural arguments are used to say, okay, this type of architecture doesn't fit into the local context, and therefore, we insist that you either have no minaret, and I mean, in case of Switzerland, there was this whole debate on minarets are forbidden in many countries, like the sound of adhan is not allowed, but the Muslims still insist on having a minaret. And that's also interesting. Why is that so? If it doesn't have the function of call to prayer, it is about visibility and the kind of right to visibility. For me, that kind of either or discussion is a very reductive one. If you look at the history of mosque architecture, the repertoire, if we are struggling about, like, shall I have a dome and minaret, and insisting on that is quite reductive of Islamic architectural repertoire too. And there's interesting scholarship on this subject by, for example, Nebahat Avciolu wrote a very interesting article on mosque as identity, which kind of looks at the history of the dome and the minaret becoming the marker of Islamic identity in the Western European context after colonial period, where kind of the forms that the colonizers have found exotic and interesting and were building as forms of like decorative garden pavilions in Western Europe now get claimed by the colonized people in those countries to say, okay, these are my forms and I'm reproducing them, and thus in a way reproducing the colonial stereotypes of themselves. So in my work, I try to push against these reductive perceptions of what is kind of how mosques should look like. As we know from the history of Islamic architecture, there is no formal definition how a mosque should look like. We only have a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad who says, where I pray, that is the mosque. So, but over time, of course, an array of forms have developed. And kind of inspired by pre-existing forms and new forms that accommodate Islamic worship. So we can argue that those forms are important as a marker of identity, but also we can say, okay, there is a huge repertoire of inspiration that we can draw from, and we don't have to reduce mosque architecture to a dome and a minaret. So in this piece, for example, the wearable mosque, I'm arguing that, the mosque is defined not necessarily by having a mihrab or a minaret, by the notion of directionality, which in this case is the orientation of the human body towards Mecca. And ritual enactment of space while performing the prayer. It also points at the elastic nature of mosque space, which historically has been used for many different functions, not just religious functions. It's an educational space, cultural space, political space. So this Diandol-Dres mosque has all of these dimensions. It's also a social space. That's why I have it a mosque for 3. Of course, this is not to say, and it's a kind of, it's not a solution, so to say, type of mosque. This is artistic work that is more like a visualized question. What is a mosque? And kind of providing a visual argument. Could this also be a mosque, right? Not to say we should not build mosques when we can wear them. We should build them. And there are ways in which that can be done, as I showed in this project, where we can find hybrid forms that speak to many different cultures in an appealing way and can maybe break down stereotypes, like in the case of the Islamic cemetery Altah. It was this diverse group of Muslims that came together. They came together over a shared concern that they needed a sanctuary, like a space for burying. But then, because of the architectural appeal of this project, this mosque and this cemetery became an attractor for non-Muslim population. Not only architects, but just people. When we had the opening of this cemetery, there were over 1,000 people, Austrians, non-Muslims, coming, being completely drawn to it, because it was kind of, the aesthetic was also like local, cool Austrian architecture, but designed by this cutting-edge architect. And they wanted to learn. It was not alien to them. It was like really beautiful, and they're touching this curtain, and they want to know everything. The mayor is like functioning as a educator and really bringing people together. So it's quite fascinating what actually just pure architecture can do. There was the other dimension here of creating a like legal form that burying according to Islamic rite would even be possible at all. But the aesthetics have their own power, I think. Thank you, Nasreen. This was a very extensive answer of the question.
There are some lovely compliments coming up in the chat box. But if there are no more questions, perhaps I can thank everyone for an incredibly thoughtful and considered session. Some great contributions there, but particularly thank you, Azra, for a wonderful talk. And I think the images will live with me for a really long time. I'd like to also thank the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and Ulrika as well for bringing us this talk on behalf of the Aga Khan Museum. Our next talk in the series will be brought to us by the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and will be on the 20th of January. And we hope to see some of you there. Until then, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight.